The midnight caller Sarah had always dreamed of living on her own. Growing up in a small town with her parents and younger brother, she'd always longed for independence. After graduating college, she finally landed a decent job in the city, giving her the opportunity to rent her very first apartment. The space wasn't big, a small one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building, but to Sarah, it was perfect. The exposed brick walls and large windows made the place feel cozy, and she couldn't wait to decorate it and make it her own. Her parents were a little worried about her living alone in a new city, but Sarah reassured them. "I'll be fine," she'd said with a smile. "The neighborhood is quiet, and the building has good security." By October, Sarah had settled in. She'd unpacked all her things, hung up some paintings her mom had given her, and even hosted a small housewarming party with a few friends. Life seemed to be going well. That all changed one chilly October night. Sarah had spent the evening curled up on her couch with a blanket, watching her favorite TV show. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. At around 11:30 p.m., she decided to call it a night. She turned off the TV, brushed her teeth, and climbed into bed, feeling content. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. The call was from an unknown number. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Normally, she wouldn't answer calls from numbers she didn't recognize, but it was late, and she thought it might be something important. Maybe it was work or someone who needed help. "Hello?" she said, her voice soft and a little groggy. There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, she thought the caller had hung up. Then she heard it, a faint voice, barely above a whisper. "I see you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She sat up in bed, clutching her phone tightly. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice wavered. There was no response. All she could hear was heavy breathing. Then the line went dead. Sarah stared at her phone, her heart pounding. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was probably just a prank call. Kids did that sort of thing all the time, didn't they? Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping over her. She got out of bed, double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked, and eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the call felt like a bad dream. Sarah told herself it was nothing and tried to focus on her day. But that night, as she sat in her living room reading a book, her phone buzzed again. It was the same unknown number. She debated whether to answer, but finally picked up. "Hello," she said, her voice firmer this time. Again, there was silence. Then the same faint voice. "You shouldn't live alone." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" she demanded. The caller didn't respond. Instead, they let out a low chuckle before hanging up. For the rest of the week, the calls continued. They always came late at night, and the voice would say things that sent shivers down her spine. "I like your hair down." That red sweater looks good on you. Why don't you smile more?" At first, Sarah tried to convince herself it was just someone playing a sick joke. But one night, the voice said something that made her blood freeze. "Nice painting above the couch." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The painting was a gift from her mom, and she knew for a fact she hadn't shared any photos of it online. No one had been in her apartment except for a couple of close friends, and they wouldn't do something like this. She called the police the next day. The officer she spoke to was sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do. "These things are hard to trace," he explained. "Block the number and let us know if anything else happens." Sarah blocked the number, but the calls didn't stop. They just started coming from a new number. Desperate, she changed her phone number entirely. For a few days, she felt a sense of relief. Maybe it was over. But one night, her phone buzzed again. This time, the screen didn't show a number, just the words, "Unknown caller." She didn't answer. A moment later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. "You can't hide from me." Panic set in. Sarah called her parents and told them everything. They begged her to come home, but Sarah didn't want to give up her independence. Instead, she decided to move to a new apartment in a different part of the city. Maybe a fresh start would help. The move was stressful, but gave her hope. She'd chosen a building with better security and made sure her new address wasn't listed publicly. For a while, everything seemed fine. The calls stopped, and Sarah started to feel like herself again. But just when she thought she was safe, the phone buzzed late one night. The screen showed "Unknown caller." Her heart sank. She didn't answer, but a text followed, "Nice new place." Sarah felt like she was losing her mind. How was this person still finding her? She changed her number again, installed security cameras, and even started taking self-defense classes. But the calls and messages kept coming, no matter what she did. One day, Sarah decided to dig into the history of her first apartment. She'd never thought much about it before, but now she was desperate for answers. She did some research online and found an old news article about the building. Her stomach turned as she read the headline, "Local woman found dead in apartment stocking case." The article described how the previous tenant, a young woman named Emily, had been harassed by an unknown stalker for months before she was murdered in her apartment. The killer had never been caught. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed her laptop. Was the same person now targeting her? Had they been watching the apartment all along? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. She wasn't safe. She decided to leave the city entirely, moving back to her hometown to stay with her parents. It wasn't what she wanted, but she couldn't live like this anymore. For a while, things seemed calm. The calls stopped, and Sarah started to feel normal again. But deep down, she knew she might never truly be free. Every time her phone buzzed, she felt a wave of dread. Even years later, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone somewhere was still watching her. The wrong number. David was a regular college student, balancing classes, part-time work, and the occasional social gathering. Like many students, he often found himself staying up late to cram for exams or finish assignments at the last minute. Sleep was a luxury, and coffee was his best friend. His dorm room, small and cluttered, reflected his chaotic lifestyle. Textbooks stacked on the desk, clothes draped over the chair, and empty coffee cups scattered around. One chilly November night, David was huddled at his desk, surrounded by notes and a half-eaten sandwich. His psychology exam was the next day, and he was determined to ace it. The silence of the dormitory was comforting, broken only by the occasional footsteps of someone heading to the bathroom. As he flipped through flashcards, his phone buzzed, breaking his focus. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "Is this Emily?" David frowned. He didn't know anyone named Emily. Without much thought, he typed back a quick reply. "Wrong number." He placed the phone back on the desk and returned to his notes, thinking it was just a simple mistake. But the texts didn't stop. A few minutes later, another message popped up. "Emily, I need to talk to you." David sighed. Whoever this was seemed persistent. He replied again, "Sorry, I'm not Emily. You've got the wrong number." This time, he hoped that would be the end of it. Yet, over the next hour, more texts came through, all from the same number. "Emily, I'm sorry. Emily, please answer me." Feeling irritated, David blocked the number and tried to focus on his studies. But just as he started to regain his concentration, his phone buzzed again. A new text, this time from a different number, read, "Emily, you can't ignore me forever." David's stomach tightened. The tone had shifted. What had started as an annoying mistake now felt unsettling. He hesitated, but decided to ignore it. Yet the messages kept coming, each one more ominous than the last. "I know where you are. You can't hide from me." By now, David was no longer annoyed, he was scared. He tried blocking each new number, but the messages kept appearing, always from a different source. His hands trembled as he held his phone. Who was this person? And why were they so convinced he was Emily? The decision to respond, David knew he couldn't just ignore this anymore. Something about the messages felt deeply wrong. They weren't just random texts. They were personal, targeted, and threatening. He decided to respond, hoping to get some clarity. He typed carefully, "Who is this? What do you want?" The reply came almost instantly. "I want you to pay for what you did." David's blood ran cold. Pay for what? He hadn't done anything. He quickly typed back, "I'm not Emily. You have the wrong person." The messages stopped for a while, and David felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they finally understood he wasn't who they were looking for. But that relief was short-lived. Around midnight, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. David opened the image and froze. It was a picture of his dorm room door, taken from the hallway. His heart pounded in his chest. Someone was outside. He scrambled to his feet and peeked through the peephole, but the corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered softly, casting eerie shadows. Whoever had sent the photo was gone. Panicked, David called campus security. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived. They searched the hallway and nearby areas, but found no one. David showed them the messages and the photo, but there wasn't much they could do. The numbers were untraceable, likely from disposable phones or apps. "Let us know if anything else happens," one of the officers said before leaving. David locked his door and pushed his desk chair against it for extra security. He sat on his bed, phone clutched tightly in his hand, staring at the screen. The messages had stopped for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A lingering threat over the next few days, David tried to return to his routine, but the fear lingered. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at small noises. He even considered moving to a different dorm, but it was the middle of the semester, and options were limited. Then, a week later, the text started again. This time, they were more cryptic. "Do you think I'll just forget? I'm closer than you think." David felt trapped. He didn't know what to do. His friends tried to reassure him, saying it was probably just a prank, but David wasn't convinced. The messages felt too deliberate, too personal. One night, he decided to dig deeper. He searched online for stories about harassment and stalking, hoping to find advice. That's when he stumbled upon news articles about a missing woman named Emily. She had disappeared from a town not far from the college about a year ago. The details were sparse, but her case remained unsolved. The photo accompanying the article showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. David didn't recognize her, but the name sent chills down his spine. Could this be the same Emily the messages were about? And if so, why were they targeting him? A dangerous game, desperate for answers, David decided to take a risk. He texted back one of the recent numbers. "What did Emily do?" The reply was quick. "She knows what she did. And you do too." David's fingers trembled as he typed. "I'm not Emily. Stop texting me." But the messages kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. "You can't run forever. I'll find you." The next night, David received another photo. This time, it was taken from inside the dormitory building, showing the entrance to his hallway. Whoever was doing this was getting closer. David knew he couldn't handle this alone. He went to the campus police and showed them everything. They took his concerns seriously and promised to increase patrols around his dorm. They also advised him to stay vigilant and report anything suspicious immediately. The final encounter for a while, the messages stopped again, and David began to feel a little safer. But one evening, as he returned to his dorm after a late-night study session, he noticed something unusual. His door, which he always locked, was slightly ajar. David's heart raced. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was dark, but he could tell something was off. His desk chair was overturned, and his belongings were scattered across the floor. On his desk was a single piece of paper with the words, "You can't hide." David backed out of the room and called campus security. They arrived quickly and searched the area, but found no one. They suggested David stay with a friend or in a hotel for a few nights while they investigated. That night, David stayed at his friend's apartment, too scared to return to his dorm. The texts didn't come that night, nor the next. Slowly, life returned to normal. The campus police never found the person responsible, but the patrols and extra security measures seemed to deter any further incidents. A year later, David had almost put the whole ordeal behind him. He had moved to a new apartment off campus and was focused on finishing his degree. One day, while scrolling through the news, he saw a headline that made his stomach drop. Suspect arrested in connection to Emily's disappearance. The article detailed how the police had finally caught a man believed to be involved in Emily's case. He had a history of stalking and harassment, and evidence linked him to her disappearance. As David read, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the same person who had tormented him? And if so, why had they chosen him as their target? David would never know for sure, but the experience left a lasting mark. He had been dragged into someone else's nightmare, and though he had escaped, he couldn't forget the fear that had gripped him during those long sleepless nights. The wrong number had changed his life forever. The echoing voice Lisa's love for road trips. Lisa had always enjoyed the open road. There was something calming about driving for hours, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the scenery passing by. She loved the freedom of it. No schedule, no obligations, just her and the endless highway. Ever since she was young, Lisa had found comfort in solitude, and these road trips were her way of finding peace. Lisa worked a busy job in marketing, where she was constantly surrounded by people and deadlines. Road trips became her escape. She planned them carefully, mapping out routes that took her through small towns, scenic views, and quiet roads. She didn't mind the isolation. In fact, she welcomed it. For her, being alone wasn't lonely. It was liberating. One weekend, feeling particularly drained, Lisa decided to take an impromptu trip. She packed a bag, grabbed some snacks, and set off in her car. She didn't have a specific destination in mind. She just wanted to drive and leave her worries behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lisa found herself in a remote area. The road was narrow, winding through dense forests on either side. It was peaceful, just as she liked it. She turned up the music and sang along, feeling a rare sense of joy. But that joy was about to turn into something else entirely. The initial encounter as Lisa drove deeper into the forested area, the cell signal on her phone began to fade. She didn't mind. She wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. The night was cool, and the headlights illuminated the road ahead. Everything seemed perfect until her phone. which was lying on the passenger seat, buzzed. Lisa glanced at the screen. A call was coming in. What caught her attention wasn't just the fact that someone was calling, but the number itself. It was her own. Confused, she picked up the phone. "That's strange," she muttered to herself. Maybe it was some sort of glitch. Still, curiosity got the better of her, and she answered. "Hello?" she said hesitantly. There was a pause, and then she heard a voice. "Hello?" the voice repeated. It sounded exactly like hers. Lisa frowned. "Who is this?" she asked. "Who is this?" the voice echoed back. The hairs on Lisa's arms stood on end. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled the phone away from her ear. The call was still connected, but she could hear her own breathing mirrored through the speaker. Quickly, she ended the call and tossed the phone back onto the seat. "It's just a prank," she told herself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. But the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The road ahead no longer seemed inviting, it seemed endless and foreboding. The repeated calls Lisa tried to focus on driving, telling herself to ignore the incident. But minutes later, her phone buzzed again. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the same number, her own. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Reluctantly, she picked up the phone and stared at the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. "Hello?" the voice mimicked, perfectly matching her tone. Lisa's breath quickened. "Who are you?" "Stop calling me," she demanded. "Who are you?" "Stop calling me," the voice replied. Her stomach churned. She hung up again, but almost immediately, the phone buzzed once more. This time, she didn't answer. The calls kept coming, one after another, the screen lighting up in the darkness. Lisa's hands were shaking. She finally grabbed the phone and turned it off. For a few moments, there was silence. Lisa exhaled, trying to steady herself. But then, her car's Bluetooth system connected, and her phone, even though it was off, started ringing again. The voice came through the car speakers, loud and clear. "Hello?" it said, as if taunting her. Lisa screamed, "Leave me alone!" The voice screamed back, matching her pitch and fury. Panicking, Lisa swerved slightly, her car's tires skidding on the edge of the road. She regained control and pulled over, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat there in the dark, trying to calm down. "This isn't real," she told herself. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. Seeking help at the gas station, Lisa spotted the faint glow of lights ahead and sighed in relief. It was a small gas station, seemingly the only sign of life for miles. She pulled in and parked near the entrance. The place was quiet, and the only other person there was a middle-aged attendant behind the counter. She walked inside, clutching her phone tightly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky. I think something's wrong with my phone." The attendant looked up from his magazine. "What's going on?" he asked, eyeing her with mild concern. Lisa hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "I keep getting calls from my own number," she said finally. "And when I answer, it's my own voice on the other end. It's copying everything I say." The attendant raised an eyebrow. "That's weird," he said. "Want me to call your number? Maybe it'll stop if someone else tries." Lisa nodded. "Please." He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. Lisa watched nervously as her phone lit up, but it didn't ring. Instead, the attendant's phone buzzed with a message. He frowned and showed it to her. The message read, "You can't stop this." Lisa's stomach dropped. The attendant looked at her, now genuinely concerned. "I don't know what kind of prank this is, but it's creepy," he said. Lisa nodded silently, her hands trembling. She thanked him and walked back to her car. The gas station's lights suddenly felt too dim, and the surrounding darkness seemed to press in on her. The night at the motel, deciding it wasn't safe to keep driving, Lisa searched for a nearby motel. She found one a few miles away, a shabby one-story building with a flickering neon sign that read "Vacancy." It wasn't inviting, but it was better than staying in her car. She checked in, avoiding eye contact with the bored-looking clerk, and hurried to her room. Once inside, she locked the door, bolted it, and pushed a chair against it for good measure. She turned off her phone and tossed it onto the bedside table. Exhausted but still on edge, Lisa lay down. The room was eerily quiet, and every creak of the old building made her jump. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she was beginning to drift off, her phone buzzed. Lisa froze. "No," she whispered. "It's off. How is it buzzing?" She reached for the phone with trembling hands and saw a new message. It read, "I'm outside." Her heart raced. Slowly, she got up and peeked through the curtains. The parking lot was empty. No one was there. She sighed in relief, but when she turned back to her phone, it was playing a video. The video showed her standing at the window, looking out. It was filmed from outside. The chilling climax, Lisa dropped the phone, her breathing erratic. She grabbed her car keys and decided she couldn't stay there any longer. She shoved her belongings into her bag and opened the door cautiously. The night air was cold, and the parking lot was eerily silent. She scanned the area, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Seeing nothing, she ran to her car and got in, locking the doors immediately. She started the engine and sped away, not caring about the direction. She just wanted to get as far away as possible. As she drove, her phone buzzed again. Against her better judgment, she glanced at it. A new message appeared, "You can't run." The car's radio crackled to life, and her own voice came through. "You can't escape me," it said, laughing eerily. Lisa screamed and turned the radio off, but the voice continued, growing louder. The headlights flickered, and the car shuddered as if something was trying to take control. Lisa gripped the wheel, tears streaming down her face. "Leave me alone," she shouted. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The car's engine purred normally, the radio was off, and her phone was dark. Lisa pulled over, sobbing. She sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The aftermath: by morning, Lisa finally found the courage to continue driving. She reached a nearby town and stopped at a diner. She was exhausted, her face pale, and her hands still shaking. The waitress asked if she was okay, but Lisa just nodded and ordered coffee. She tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was stress or exhaustion or some elaborate prank. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something unexplainable had happened that night. Lisa returned home and sold her car a week later. She quit her job, moved to a busier part of the city, and vowed never to take another road trip alone. Even now, years later, she can't hear the sound of her phone ringing without feeling a chill run down her spine. And she always makes sure to keep her curtains closed at night. The dead friend Emma walked through the small park near her apartment, a place she and Claire had often visited. 6 months had passed since Claire's tragic car accident, but for Emma, it still felt like yesterday. Every corner of her life was a reminder of her best friend, their inside jokes, late-night talks, and the countless adventures they had shared. The pain of her loss was raw and relentless. Claire had been more than a best friend to Emma. She was family. They had met in middle school, two shy girls sitting alone at lunch, until Claire's bright smile broke the silence. From that day, they were inseparable. Together, they navigated the highs and lows of life. Exams, first loves, heartbreaks, and everything in between. Claire's infectious laughter could brighten even Emma's darkest days, and now, without her, the world seemed dull and hollow. Emma often replayed the day of the accident in her mind, even though she hadn't been there. Claire had been driving home late at night when a drunk driver ran a red light and collided with her car. The news had shattered Emma. She remembered the phone call vividly, her mother's trembling voice delivering the unbearable truth. It was the kind of pain that etched itself into her soul. Months later, Emma still struggled to move forward. She had kept all of Claire's belongings that her parents had offered her: a box of trinkets, photos, and even Claire's favorite sweater, which still carried her scent. On some nights, Emma would sit with the box, sifting through memories, tears streaming down her face. One evening, as Emma sat in her dimly lit apartment, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. The notification displayed a name she hadn't seen in months: Claire. For a moment, Emma's heart leapt, but logic quickly took over. Claire was gone. It had to be a mistake or a cruel prank. Still, curiosity compelled her to open the message. "Hey, it's me. I miss you," it read. Emma stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Her first instinct was anger. Who would do something so heartless? She typed back quickly, "Who is this? This isn't funny." The response came almost immediately. "It's Claire. Don't you recognize me?" A chill ran down Emma's spine. The words on the screen didn't feel like a prank. There was something eerily personal about them. But it couldn't be Claire. It simply wasn't possible. "This is cruel," Emma replied. "Whoever you are, stop it." Instead of stopping, the messages continued. "Remember our trip to the lake? Remember when we got lost in the woods?" Emma's breath caught. Those were private memories, things only Claire would know. The trip to the lake had been one of their favorite weekends, a spontaneous escape filled with laughter and adventure. And getting lost in the woods had been a terrifying but ultimately bonding experience they often joked about. How could anyone else know these details? Desperate for answers, Emma called Claire's parents the next day. She hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question without sounding delusional. Finally, she asked, "Did you do anything with Claire's phone?" Claire's mother's voice was soft but firm. "No, dear. We destroyed it after the accident. We didn't want it falling into the wrong hands." "Why do you ask?" Emma mumbled an excuse about a strange number contacting her and quickly ended the call. Her head spun with confusion. If the phone was gone, how was she receiving these messages? And why did they feel so real? Over the next few weeks, the texts continued sporadically. They weren't threatening or intrusive, but they unsettled Emma. Each one referenced a memory or moment that only Claire could have known. "You always hated my favorite movie, but you watched it with me anyway. Remember the time we skipped class and spent the day at the beach?" Emma tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had found Claire's phone and somehow retrieved its data. But that didn't explain everything. Some of the details in the messages weren't things they had ever written down or shared online. It was as if the person texting her was inside her mind. One night, Emma received a message that was different from the others. "I'm in trouble. Please help me." Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. She typed back, "What do you mean? Where are you?" A photo arrived in response. It showed a dark road illuminated by headlights. Emma recognized it instantly. It was the spot where Claire had died. Panic surged through her. She debated what to do. Calling the police seemed ridiculous. What would she even say? Instead, she grabbed her keys and drove to the location. Her mind raced with questions. Was this a sick joke? A cry for help? Or something else entirely? When Emma arrived, the area was deserted. She parked her car and stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the rustling of leaves. She stood there for a long time, scanning the darkness for any sign of life. Her phone buzzed again. "Thank you for coming. Goodbye." And just like that, the messages stopped. Emma waited, hoping for more, but her phone remained silent. Eventually, she got back into her car and drove home. her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Was it really Claire reaching out to her? Or had someone played an elaborate trick? Over the following weeks, Emma found herself thinking about the experience constantly. She couldn't explain what had happened, but a part of her felt at peace. The messages, whether real or not, had given her something she hadn't had since Claire's death: closure. It felt as if Claire had reached out one last time to say goodbye. Though Emma never received another text, she held on to the memory of that night. She stopped questioning it and chose to see it as a final gift from her best friend. Wherever Claire was, Emma believed she had found a way to let her know she was okay. The haunted phone Tom had always been a fan of thrift stores. There was something about the hunt that excited him. He loved digging through shelves and racks, searching for hidden treasures, a vintage jacket, a rare book, or even quirky home decor. To him, thrift shopping was like going on a treasure hunt, and the best part was that it rarely cost much. One Saturday, Tom visited a new thrift store in town. The place was packed with all sorts of second-hand items, from furniture to electronics. As he browsed the shelves, something caught his eye: an old flip phone. It was small and had a retro charm to it. The phone looked like it belonged to a different era, with its tiny screen and clunky buttons. $5? Tom muttered to himself, looking at the price tag. Why not? He wasn't planning to use it as a phone. He just thought it would make a cool addition to his growing collection of vintage items. He took it home and placed it on his kitchen counter. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of him. He plugged the phone into an old charger he found in a drawer and waited for it to power on. Surprisingly, the phone still worked. The screen lit up with a soft green glow, and a simple menu appeared. As he scrolled through the phone, he noticed there wasn't much on it. No photos, no messages, and just one contact saved. The contact's name was Help. That's weird, Tom said to himself. He stared at the name for a moment, debating whether or not to call. Eventually, curiosity won out. He pressed the call button and waited. The phone rang only once before a woman's voice answered. She sounded frantic, her words rushing out between sobs. "Please, you have to help me. He's coming for me. I don't know how much time I have left." Tom froze. Who is this?" he asked, but before he could say anything else, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in confusion. Seconds later, the phone buzzed. A new text message had arrived. It simply read, "You shouldn't have called." Tom laughed nervously. "Okay, someone's messing with me," he said, trying to convince himself it was just a prank. Maybe the phone had belonged to someone who had set it up as a joke. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept over him. Over the next few days, the phone began acting strangely. It would ring at odd hours, usually in the middle of the night. Whenever Tom answered, he'd hear static and faint whispers, as though someone was speaking from far away. At first, he tried to brush it off. He told himself It was probably just interference or some glitch in the old phone. But then things got worse. One night, the phone rang at 3 o'clock. Tom groggily picked it up, ready to silence it, but when he answered, he heard a deep, menacing voice on the other end. "You're next," the voice growled. Tom's heart raced. He hung up immediately and threw the phone onto the couch. His apartment felt eerily quiet, and every creak and shadow seemed to take on a sinister quality. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the phone from across the room. The next morning, Tom decided he'd had enough. He planned to get rid of the phone once and for all. He drove to a nearby park and tossed it into a trash bin. "Good riddance," he muttered as he walked away. But when he returned home, his stomach dropped. The phone was sitting on his kitchen counter, exactly where he had left it before. "No way," Tom whispered, his hands trembling. He checked his apartment, thinking maybe someone had broken in and brought the phone back as a cruel joke. But nothing else was out of place, and the doors and windows were still locked. Desperate, Tom tried to destroy the phone. He smashed it with a hammer, threw it into a fire, and even tried running it over with his car. Each time, he thought he had finally gotten rid of it, but the phone always reappeared, completely intact, back on his kitchen counter. Tom's life began to spiral. He started hearing strange noises at night, footsteps in the hallway, whispers in the dark. He began seeing shadows move out of the corner of his eye, but whenever he turned to look, nothing was there. The phone's haunting presence seemed to be spreading, invading every part of his life. One night, Tom woke up to find the phone lying on his pillow, inches from his face. The screen was cracked, and a message was scrawled across it in jagged letters. "Leave it behind." Terrified, Tom packed a bag and left his apartment that very night. He drove for hours until he reached a dense forest on the outskirts of town. There, he dug a deep hole and buried the phone. He covered it with dirt and rocks, hoping that would be the end of it. Afterward, Tom moved to a new apartment in a different city. For months, he lived in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder and avoiding anything secondhand. Slowly, he began to rebuild his life. The nightmares stopped, and the strange occurrences faded away. But even now, years later, Tom still can't walk past a thrift store without feeling a chill run down his spine. He'll never forget the haunted phone and the terror it brought into his life. And he'll never know what might have happened if he hadn't buried it in the woods.